April 15th, 1945. Somewhere in the Harz Mountains, central Germany. The air smelled of pine resin and gunpowder. Morning mist clung to the slopes like a shroud, blurring the edges of shattered trees and cratered earth. In a hastily converted schoolhouse near the town of Nordhausen, German nurses moved through dim corridors lined with wounded men. Their footsteps echoed against tile floors stained with mud and blood. Outside, the rumble of American tanks grew louder, a mechanical thunder that made the window panes tremble. Inside, a different kind of trembling had begun, one born not of explosives, but of anticipation and dread. These nurses, most of them barely into their 20s, wore the gray uniforms of the Wehrmacht Medical Corps. Their faces bore the exhaustion of years spent binding wounds that ideology could not heal, of watching boys die while officers spoke of final victory. They had been told, repeatedly and with fervor, what would happen when the Americans arrived. The Bolsheviks would come with savagery, they were warned. But the Americans, the decadent, mongrel Americans, would bring something worse: humiliation, violation, and the cruel vengeance of a mongrel race corrupted by Jewish influence and Negro blood. The propaganda had painted vivid pictures in their minds. Pictures that now, as the tank treads ground closer, seem terrifyingly about to become real. One day, a young woman named Margaret stood at a window overlooking the main road. Her hands, raw from constant washing and work, gripped the windowsill. She watched as the first American Sherman tank rounded the bend, its white star stark against olive-drab steel. Behind it came trucks, jeeps, and columns of infantry in helmets that looked almost comically rounded compared to the angular German Storhelm. She turned back to the ward, where 37 wounded German soldiers lay in various states of injury. Some could walk. Others would never walk again. All of them watched the doorway with the same question in their eyes: what happens now? To understand the weight of that question, one must step back to the beginning of the war, to the carefully constructed universe of belief that had carried Germany into the abyss. From 1933 onward, the National Socialist regime had not merely governed. It had shaped reality itself, bending truth and perception until millions of Germans lived inside a narrative as sealed and complete as a snow globe. Within that narrative, Germany was a victim and a hero, surrounded by enemies who envied its strength and conspired to destroy its rightful place in the world. The Slavs were subhuman. The Jews were parasites. The British were hypocritical imperialists. And the Americans? The Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of true sacrifice, a mongrel nation of gangsters and jazz musicians, grown fat on materialism and corrupted by racial mixing. This was not merely propaganda for public consumption. It was doctrine, taught in schools, preached from pulpits, broadcast over radios, printed in newspapers, and whispered between neighbors who had learned that doubt was dangerous. By 1945, an entire generation had been marinated in this worldview. The nurses at Nordhausen were products of that generation. They had joined the medical corps not out of political fanaticism, necessarily, but out of duty, patriotism, and often simple necessity. Yet even the least ideological among them carried the residue of years spent inside the regime-sealed narrative. They knew, in the way one knows the shape of one's own home in the dark, that the enemy was monstrous. But by April 1945, the snow globe had begun to crack. The rye that was supposed to last 1,000 years was collapsing in its 12th. The Eastern Front had imploded. Soviet armies were grinding toward Berlin with a fury born of unspeakable suffering. In the West, American, British, and Canadian forces had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping through Germany with a speed that bewildered defenders who had expected Fortress Europe to hold. The nurses at Nordhausen had heard the rumors, whispers that slipped through the cracks of official silence. Cities burned. Refugees choked the roads. Officers shot themselves rather than face surrender. And everywhere, the question, what will they do to us? The Americans entered Nordhausen on a Thursday. Margaret would remember that detail for the rest of her life. Not the date, but the day of the week, because Thursdays had always meant fresh bread at her family's bakery in Ofit, and that morning she had thought absurdly of bread, of the ordinary rhythms of a world that no longer existed. The first American soldier through the door of the makeshift hospital was a medic, a staff sergeant with a Red Cross on his helmet and a Thompson submachine gun slung over his shoulder. He was young, perhaps 23, with a sun-weathered face and eyes that scanned the room with professional efficiency. Behind him came an officer, a captain in the medical corps, and then more medics, and then combat infantry who secured the building with swift, practiced movements. The German nurses stood frozen. Some had their hands raised. Others simply waited, paralyzed by the collision of expectation and reality. The captain, his name was Samuel Hartman, a surgeon from Philadelphia, surveyed the ward. He saw the wounded men, the inadequate supplies, the exhaustion on the nurses' faces. He saw the fear. And then he did something that shattered the snow globe completely. He removed his helmet. He set it down on a table. And he said, in slow but serviceable German, "We're here to help. Show us your most critical cases first." For a moment, no one moved. The words didn't fit. They were enemy soldiers, armed and victorious, standing in a room full of wounded Germans, men who hours earlier had been trying to kill them. The script called for brutality, for vengeance, for the acting out of the atrocity stories whispered in darkened rooms. But Captain Hartman was asking about critical cases. He was asking the nurses, the enemy nurses, to do their jobs. Margaret found her voice first. "The corner," she said, her words stumbling in German-accented shock. "3 men. Abdominal wounds. We have no plasma. No." She stopped, realizing she was giving tactical information to the enemy. Information that revealed their weakness. Captain Hartman nodded. "Show me." He turned to his medics. "Get plasma up here. Morgan, start triage. Anyone critical gets stabilized first. Ours. I don't care. We treat the wounds, not the uniform." What happened over the next 72 hours would be recounted in letters, in post-war testimonies, in the quiet conversations of women who lived to see their country rebuilt from rubble. The American medics worked alongside the German nurses, not as conquerors and conquered, but as medical professionals united by the imperative older than any flag, the duty to heal. They set up proper triage. They brought in supplies that seemed to materialize from inexhaustible stores: plasma, morphine, sulfur powder, clean bandages, surgical instruments that gleamed under electric lights powered by American generators. The German nurses, who had been making do with boiled rags and dwindling stocks of ersatz medications, stared at the abundance as if witnessing a miracle. But it was not the supplies that broke them. It was the manner. It was the way the American medics handled German prisoners with the same care they gave their own wounded. It was the way they used morphine without hesitation on enemy soldiers screaming in pain. It was a way they spoke gently to men who did not understand English, using touch and tone to communicate what words could not. It was a way they worked through the night, exhausted themselves, never once making the distinction that ideology had taught was fundamental, that some lives mattered and others did not. One incident crystallized it all. A young German soldier, no more than 19, had taken shrapnel to his chest and abdomen. He was dying. Anyone with medical training could see it. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His lips had gone blue. His eyes held the distant look of someone already halfway gone. A German military surgeon, operating under the brutal calculus of triage in a collapsing Reich, would have moved on. Morphine was too precious to waste on the dying. But the American medic, a corporal from Nebraska named James Kowalski, knelt beside the boy and prepared a syringe of morphine. A German nurse, a woman named Hilda, watched and then spoke without thinking. "Why? He's going to die anyway." Kowalski looked up at her. His face was drawn with fatigue, streaked with dirt and older bloodstains. "Because he doesn't need to die in pain," he said simply. He administered the morphine, adjusted the boy's position to ease his breathing, and stayed there, one hand on the soldier's shoulder, until the boy's eyes closed and his breathing stopped. Then Kowalski said a quiet prayer, closed the boy's eyes, and moved on to the next patient. Hilda turned away. She walked quickly to a supply closet, closed the door behind her, and wept. She wept for the boy who had died peacefully instead of in agony. She wept for the years of propaganda that had taught her to see enemies instead of human beings. She wept for the gap between what she had been told and what she had just witnessed. And she wept because in that simple act of mercy, morphine given to a dying enemy, she had seen something that 12 years of National Socialism had tried to erase: the idea that humanity was indivisible, that suffering transcended uniform and flag, that decency was not the province of one race or ideology but a universal birthright. The transformation did not happen all at once, nor did it happen uniformly. Some nurses clung to their training, suspicious and resentful even as they accepted American help. The architecture of belief, once built, does not collapse easily, but for most, the evidence accumulated with relentless weight. They saw American soldiers share their rations with German prisoners, not scraps, but the same food they ate themselves. They saw American doctors operate on German wounded with the same skill and care they gave to their own casualties. They saw black American soldiers, the racially inferior troops of propaganda, treating wounded Germans with professionalism and, when appropriate, kindness. They saw Jewish American soldiers, identifiable by the small Hebrew characters some wore on their dog tags, working to save German lives without hesitation or vengeance. The dissonance was unbearable. Everything they had been taught said this should not be happening. The mongrel Americans, the decadent democracy supposedly rotted by Jewish influence and racial mixing, were behaving with a discipline and humanity that put the master race to shame. The contradiction forced a question that, once asked, could not be unasked. What else had we been lied to about? Margaret would later describe it as a feeling of waking from a dream, or rather, realizing that what she thought was waking life had been the dream, and the nightmare reality was just now coming into focus. The Americans were not supermen. They were ordinary soldiers, tired and scared and far from home. They cursed and smoked and complained about the food. They were flawed, human, imperfect. But they operated from a set of principles that, however imperfectly applied, recognized a bedrock truth, that human dignity was not contingent on race, nation, or ideology. They had come from a country that was itself imperfect, still struggling with its own racial sins, still working out the contradictions between its ideals and its practices. But those ideals existed. They were written into founding documents. They were taught in schools. They were contested in courts and legislatures. And here, in a shattered schoolhouse in the Harz Mountains, they were being lived out by exhausted medics who gave morphine to dying enemy soldiers because it was the right thing to do. The symbolic weight of food became impossible to ignore. American soldiers seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of it. C rations, K rations, D rations, meals in cans and wax paper packages, each one containing more calories and variety than many Germans had seen in months. The nurses watched as American soldiers casually ate chocolate bars, drank real coffee, smoked cigarettes without hoarding them like precious currency. When the medics took breaks, they shared their food without fanfare. A corporal handed Margaret a can of peaches and syrup, peaches, in April, in the middle of a war zone. She stared at it as if it were an artifact from another planet. When she finally opened it and tasted the sweet, sticky fruit, she felt something close to despair. Not because the peaches were poison or mocking, but because their very existence proved a point propaganda had tried desperately to obscure. America was not weak. It was not on the verge of collapse. It was so strong, so abundant, that it could feed its armies across an ocean and still have enough to share with a defeated enemy. The chocolate was even more devastating. American soldiers handed out Hershey bars to German children like it was nothing, like chocolate was so common it could be given away to strangers. German children, who had not seen real chocolate in years, who had grown up on ersatz everything, ersatz coffee made from acorns, ersatz honey made from sugar beets, ersatz hope made from propaganda. The casual abundance was a kind of ideological warfare more effective than any bomb. It said, "You were told we were decadent and weak. But we are here, we are fed, we are strong, and we have enough to share." What does that say about what you were told? One afternoon, an American lieutenant named Robert Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants, another living refutation of the racial theories that had underpinned the Reich, organized a distribution of surplus rations to the civilian staff at the hospital. He did it without drama, without speeches. He simply had his men bring in crates of food and told the German nurses to take what they needed. Margaret watched him, this officer whose very existence contradicted everything she had been taught about American weakness and racial purity, and felt the last foundations of her old worldview crumble. Chen moved with quiet authority. His men respected him. He made decisions with calm competence. And he was Chinese-American, one of the mongrel mixtures that was supposed to weaken the American military. Yet here he was, victorious, competent, and decent. The evidence continued to accumulate. American chaplains held services and invited German prisoners to attend if they wished. Protestant, Catholic, even Jewish chaplains made space for the enemy in their rituals of comfort and meaning. American graves registration units treated German dead with the same care they gave their own, recording names, collecting personal effects to return to families, burying the bodies with dignity. When a cache of documents was found revealing the location of nearby concentration camps, the American command brought in German medical personnel, including some of the nurses, and forced them to witness what had been done in their nation's name. The tours of Nordhausen's own concentration camp, a subcamp of Mittelbau-Dora where thousands had died in the underground rocket factories, were devastating. The nurses saw the skeletal survivors, the mass graves, the casual evil of a system they had served without fully understanding. But even here, even in the face of such horror, the Americans maintained their discipline. They were angry, furiously, righteously angry, but they did not take that anger out on the nurses or the wounded prisoners. They documented the crimes. They arrested the perpetrators they could find. They cared for the survivors with the same medical diligence they had shown German soldiers. And they made a distinction, one that German ideology had tried to erase, the distinction between individual guilt and collective identity, between those who had committed crimes and those who had simply been swept along by history's current. This distinction was not perfect. There would be injustices, false accusations, punishments that fell on the innocent. The denazification process would be flawed and incomplete. But the principle existed, that guilt was individual, not racial, and that justice required evidence and judgment, not collective vengeance. For nurses who had been taught that entire peoples, Jews, Slavs, Romani, were collectively guilty simply by existing, this was another crack in the snow globe. It suggested that the Americans operated from a different moral framework, one in which humanity was a default and inhumanity required justification. Margaret's transformation was gradual but irreversible. She began to ask questions she had never thought to ask before. If the Americans, whom she had been taught to despise, were capable of such decency, what else about the Ray Ames teachings had been lies? If the inferior races fought with courage and treated the enemy with mercy, what did that say about the theory of racial hierarchy? If the decadent democracy could produce soldiers who shared their food and gave morphine to dying enemies, what did that say about the supposed superiority of authoritarian discipline? She found herself watching the American soldiers with anthropological fascination. They argued with each other, debated orders, complained openly about decisions made by distant commanders. This was not the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht. It was messier, noisier, more chaotic. But it worked. It worked because the soldiers believed, however imperfectly, that they were fighting for something beyond obedience, for a set of principles that valued individual dignity and collective well-being. They were cynical and idealistic in equal measure, distrustful of grand rhetoric, but committed to the small decencies that made civilization possible. One evening, as the fighting moved east and the hospital stabilized, an American medic named Thomas Rivera sat outside smoking a cigarette. Margaret, taking a break from a 12-hour shift, found herself sitting nearby. They did not speak at first. His English and her German existed in separate universes. But then Rivera offered her a cigarette. She hesitated, then accepted. They smoked in silence, two exhausted medical professionals watching the sunset over a broken country. Finally, in halting German supplemented by gestures, Rivera said something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. War is stupid. We all bleed the same. It was not profound. It was not eloquent. But it carried a weight of truth that years of propaganda had tried to bury. They did all bleed the same. The blood that soaked through bandages did not care about nationality or ideology. Suffering was universal. And if suffering was universal, then so was the obligation to alleviate it. This was a principle that animated the American medics, however imperfectly they understood it themselves. It was a principle rooted in the ideals of their nation, the idea that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that governments exist to serve the people rather than the reverse. These ideals have been honored more in the breach than the observance throughout American history. They had coexisted with slavery and segregation, with the genocide of indigenous peoples, with exclusion and injustice. But they existed. They were written down. They could be invoked, fought for, expanded. And they had produced a generation of soldiers who, whatever their personal prejudices, operated from a framework that recognized enemy humanity. By the time the hospital was handed over to British medical units and the American forces moved on, the transformation among the nurses was nearly complete. They had entered the war as believers in a totalitarian ideology that promised order, strength, and racial destiny. They emerged from it as witnesses to that ideology's utter bankruptcy. They had seen what the master race had built: camps of death, cities of rubble, a generation of broken boys dying for a lie. And they had seen what the decadent mongrel had brought: medical supplies, food, mercy, and a framework of decency that, however imperfect, recognized the humanity of the enemy. The tears came at different times for different nurses. For Hilda, it was watching the American medic give morphine to the dying boy. For Margaret, it was the moment she tasted it in peaches and understood the depth of her own deprivation, not just material, but spiritual and intellectual. For others, it came later, in the quiet years of Reconstruction, when they had time to process what they had witnessed. But the tears, when they came, were not just grief. They were recognition. Recognition of what had been lost, what had been done in Germany's name, and what had been revealed about the alternative. One nurse, in a letter written in 1947, described it this way: "We were taught to see the world in terms of strong and weak, superior and inferior, master and slave. We were taught that mercy was weakness, that compassion was sentimentality, that only ruthless strength mattered." And then came the Americans, who were strong enough to be merciful, powerful enough to be kind, victorious enough to share their food with the defeated. They showed us that strength without decency is not strength at all. It is just brutality eating itself. We wept because we saw what we had lost, what we had never really had. The idea that human beings owe each other a fundamental respect simply because we share the same fragile existence. The symbolism of that shared cigarette between Margaret and the American medic resonated beyond the moment. Cigarettes, like chocolate and canned peaches, became symbols of the abundance and generosity that characterized the American presence. But more than that, they symbolized a kind of transaction, the sharing of a small comfort between former enemies, the recognition that war was, as Rivera had said, stupid, and that the human connection was more fundamental than the political divisions that had set nations at each other's throats. In the years that followed, as Germany was divided and rebuilt, as the full extent of the Holocaust was revealed, as the Cold War imposed new divisions and new fears, the nurses who had worked alongside American medics in places like Nordhausen carried a particular kind of knowledge. They knew, from direct experience, that ideology was a lens that distorted reality, that propaganda could make monsters of ordinary people and obscure the humanity of the designated enemy. They knew that the alternative to totalitarianism was not chaos or weakness, but a different kind of order, one rooted in the messy, contested, imperfect ideals of democracy and human rights. This knowledge did not make them saints. Some remained bitter, resentful of Germany's defeat and the years of hardship that followed. Some clung to fragments of the old ideology, unable to fully relinquish the worldview that had shaped their youth. But many, perhaps most, carried forward a quiet determination, to bear witness to what they had seen, to tell their children and grandchildren that the propaganda had been lies, that the enemy had shown them more humanity than their own leaders, and that the values of decency, compassion, and respect for human dignity were not national possessions but universal aspirations. April 1945 became May, and May became the end of the war. The nurses dispersed. Some returned to ruined cities. Others stayed in the medical field, working in the chaotic conditions of post-war reconstruction. Margaret eventually made her way back to Erfurt, which ended up in the Soviet zone. She worked in a hospital there, and later, after the wall fell, she would speak to historians about what she had witnessed. She was careful in her testimony, precise about details, unwilling to mythologize or simplify. But when asked about the moment that changed her understanding of the war, she always returned to that first day, when Captain Hartmann removed his helmet and asked to see the most critical cases first. It was such a small thing, she would say. Just a professional courtesy, really, but it shattered everything. We had been told they were savages, that they would rape and murder us, and instead they asked us to do our jobs. They treated us as colleagues. They gave morphine to our dying soldiers. Every act of basic decency was a refutation of everything we had been taught. And I realized that we had been living in a kind of prison, a prison made of lies, and these mongrel Americans, these soldiers we had been taught to despise, were the ones who opened the door. Others echoed similar sentiments. The recurring theme, in letters and testimonies and quiet conversations, was surprise, shock at the gap between propaganda and reality, at the humanity of the enemy, at the abundance that made sharing possible, at the principles that elevated mercy over vengeance. This shock was not universal. Plenty of Germans experienced the American occupation differently, particularly those in leadership positions, or those who encountered soldiers whose personal prejudices overrode professional discipline. War brings out the best and worst in people, and the Americans were no exception. But for the medical personnel, for the nurses who worked alongside American medics in the chaotic final weeks of the war, the overall impression was clear. They had been lied to, profoundly and systematically, and the truth was more complex, more humane, and ultimately more hopeful than the lies had ever been. There is a photograph, taken in late April 1945, that captures something of this transformation. It shows a group of people standing outside the Nordhausen Hospital, American medics, German nurses, a British liaison officer, a few civilian staff. They are not posing formally. The photographer, an American Signal Corps lieutenant, just snapped a candid shot during a lull in the work. What is striking about the photograph is the body language. The people are standing close together, not in rigid military formation, but in the casual proximity of colleagues. One of the German nurses, it is not clear which one, the quality of the photograph is poor, has her hand raised as if in mid-conversation. An American medic is smiling at something off-camera. Another nurse looks exhausted but not afraid. There is a provisional quality to the scene, a sense of people navigating new territory together, but the fear that had characterized the first encounters is gone. The photograph is unremarkable in most respects. It is one of millions taken during the war, a minor documentary footnote, but it represents something profound, the moment when enemies became, however tentatively, human beings to each other. The ideological categories that had defined the war, Aryan and mongrel, master and inferior, German and American, had not disappeared entirely, but they had been complicated, diluted, rendered inadequate to the lived reality of people working side by side to heal the wounded. In the final accounting, the story of German nurses weeping at American mercy is not a story of American exceptionalism. The United States was not, in 1945, a paragon of virtue. Its military was still segregated. Its Japanese-American citizens had been interned in camps. Its cities practiced legal segregation. Its treatment of indigenous peoples remained a shameful chapter still being written. The American soldiers who showed mercy at Nordhausen were products of an imperfect nation, carrying their own prejudices and limitations. But they were also products of a tradition, however imperfectly realized, that valued certain principles, that all people possess inherent dignity, that justice required evidence and process, that strength could be tempered by mercy, that abundance created an obligation to share. These principles were not uniquely American. They were Enlightenment ideals, echoed in various forms across democratic societies. But in the context of 1945, in the rubble of a regime that had explicitly rejected those ideals in favor of racial hierarchy and totalitarian power, the contrast was stark. The nurses wept not because Americans were perfect, but because they represented an alternative to the lies that had shaped German society for 12 years. They wept because in the midst of war's chaos and brutality, they had witnessed moments of grace, grace that ideology said should not exist, grace that refuted everything they had been taught about the enemy and about themselves. The epilogue to this story extends far beyond 1945. The nurses who witnessed American mercy became part of the generation that rebuilt Germany, that grappled with the weight of what had been done in their nation's name, that raised children in a new republic founded on the rejection of totalitarianism. Some of them became advocates for reconciliation, for international cooperation, for the idea that national identity should never again become a prison that obscured common humanity. Others simply lived quiet lives, carrying their memories like talismans against the resurgence of the old lies. But the tears they shed in April 1945, tears of shock, relief, grief, and recognition, those tears represented something that transcends a specific historical moment. They represented the human capacity to see through propaganda, to recognize truth when confronted with it, to choose decency over ideology when the choice is made stark. In that schoolhouse hospital in the Harz Mountains, in the midst of civilization's collapse, a simple transaction took place. Enemy soldiers treated enemy wounded with the same care they gave their own, and in so doing, they revealed the emptiness of the ideology that had set nation against nation. The chocolate bars and canned peaches, the morphine syrettes and plasma bags, the cigarettes shared in exhausted silence, these were the sacraments of a different kind of faith in human solidarity that survived even the sustained assault of industrial violence and totalitarian propaganda. The American soldiers who distributed these gifts did not think of themselves as performing symbolic acts. They were just doing their jobs, following the training that told them to treat the wounds, not the uniform. But in that professional discipline, in that casual generosity born of abundance, they carried forward an idea that human beings, regardless of nationality or ideology, owed each other a baseline of respect and mercy simply because they shared the same fragile existence on the same small planet. The German nurses who wept understood this, even if they could not articulate it fully at the time. They wept because they saw the gap between what they had been told and what was true. They wept because they recognized, in the kindness of enemy soldiers, the outlines of the world that might have been, that could still be, if people chose decency over domination, abundance over scarcity, mercy over vengeance. They wept because in the midst of history's darkest chapter, they had witnessed a small, provisional, imperfect demonstration of what it means to be human, to see suffering and move to alleviate it, to have power and choose restraint, to be victorious and still show grace. That lesson, learned in the ruins of Nordhausen, remains as urgent today as it was in April 1945. The snow globes of ideology still exist, still seal people inside narratives that make enemies of neighbors and justify cruelty as strength. But the truth remains, stubborn and ineradicable. We all bleed the same. The morphine that eases suffering does not care about the uniform. The food that sustains life does not check national identity. And the tears that flow when we recognize our shared humanity, those tears are the most human thing of all, the sign that beneath the layers of propaganda and prejudice, something essential remains, the knowledge that we are all, in the end, just people trying to live through history, and that how we treat each other in the dark times defines who we are far more than any flag or slogan ever could. The nurses at Nordhausen learned that lesson the hard way. Their tears were the price of that education. But the knowledge they gained, that decency transcends ideology, that mercy is strength, that abundance creates the obligation to share, that knowledge is a legacy, a gift passed down through generations, a reminder that even in civilization's collapse, even when the lies seem total, the truth is still there, waiting to be seen by those with the courage to open their eyes.